Imagine this. A cocky, racist cop pulls over a black man driving a nice car, thinking he's about to ruin someone's day. He's smirking, ready to throw his weight around, until he checks the ID. That smug grin? Gone in an instant. Why? Because the man he stopped isn't just anybody. He's the head of internal affairs, the guy who investigates cops like him for a living. Stick around, folks, because this Reddit story gets better with every twist. And trust me, you'll want to hear how it ends. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the channel where we dig into the wildest, most jaw-dropping stories from Reddit. Perfect for those of us who've seen a thing or two in life. I'm your host, and today, I've got a tale that's got everything. Drama, justice, and a good old-fashioned lesson in humility. It's the kind of story that makes you sit back, sip your coffee, and say, well, I'll be darned. So, let's dive in. This one comes straight from the Reddit threads, where folks share real-life moments that sound almost too good to be true. Picture a quiet afternoon on a small-town road. A police officer, let's call him Officer Dan, spots a shiny black sedan cruising along. Now, Officer Dan's the type who's been on the force a little too long, you know? He's got that chip on his shoulder, and he doesn't like seeing certain folks driving cars nicer than his. The driver? A black man, dressed sharp, minding his own business. To Dan, that's suspicious enough. So, he flips on those flashing lights, pulls the sedan over, and struts up to the window like he owns the road. License and registration, he barks, already picturing himself writing a ticket, or worse. The driver, calm as can be, hands over his ID. Dan takes one look, expecting some nobody he can intimidate. But then his eyes catch the name. His face goes white as a sheet. Why? Because this isn't just any guy. This is James Carter, the head of internal affairs for the whole police department. That's right, folks, the man who holds every cop's career in his hands. Now, for those of you who might not know, internal affairs is the division that keeps cops in line. They investigate complaints, dig into misconduct, and, yes, they can fire officers who step out of bounds. So, imagine Officer Dan's brain trying to catch up. 1 minute, he's flexing his authority. The next, he's staring down the barrel of his own worst nightmare. According to the Reddit post, shared by someone who claims they heard it from a friend of a friend, you know how these stories go, James Carter didn't even flinch. He just sat there, cool as a cucumber, watching Dan squirm. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady. Dan stammered something about a routine stop, but you could tell he was sweating bullets. See, folks, James wasn't just some desk jockey. He'd been on the force for decades, worked his way up, and knew every trick in the book. He'd seen guys like Dan before, and he wasn't about to let this slide. Now, let's pause here for a second. I know some of you watching might be thinking, did this really happen? And fair enough, Reddit's full of tall tales. But whether it's 100% true or spiced up a bit, the heart of it rings real, doesn't it? We've all heard stories of folks judging a book by its cover and getting a big surprise. Back in my day, I remember a neighbor who thought the new guy on the block was trouble. Turns out he was a retired judge. Same vibe here. So, what does Officer Dan do? He tries to backpedal, mumbling about how he's just doing his job. But James isn't having it. He leans forward and says, "You know, officer, I spend my days looking into stops just like this one. Maybe I should take a closer look at your record." Boom. That's when Dan realizes he's not just in hot water, he's in boiling lava. The Reddit poster says Dan practically begged for forgiveness right there on the side of the road, but James just smiled and drove off, leaving him to stew. This is where the story starts getting juicy, folks, because James didn't let it end there. Word is, he went back to his office and pulled Dan's file. Turns out this wasn't the first time Dan had pulled a stunt like this. There were complaints, nothing proven, mind you, but enough to raise an eyebrow. And James? He wasn't about to let a bad apple spoil the bunch. Here's the second part of the text, translated into English. 25,000 characters, significantly longer than the first part, continuing the story seamlessly. It's written in a conversational style tailored for an English-speaking American audience aged 60 plus, with added reflections and audience engagement. James Carter drove away from that stop, leaving Officer Dan standing on the roadside like a deer caught in headlights. But James wasn't the type to just let things slide and call it a day. He went back to his office with a clear plan to get to the bottom of it all. And folks, when he started digging, he found things that'd make your eyebrows shoot right up to your hairline. According to the Reddit post, Dan's file was thicker than those old phone books we used to keep by the rotary phone, and not in a good way. There were complaints from folks saying he'd targeted them for no good reason, especially if they didn't fit his idea of who belonged in that town. Nothing had ever stuck before. You know how it goes. Cops often cover for each other, but James wasn't your typical boss. He'd clawed his way up the ranks the hard way, earning respect through sweat and grit, and he wasn't afraid to step on a few toes if justice demanded it. Word is, a few days later, James called Dan in for a little chat. Picture yourself in Dan's shoes, walking into that office, knowing the man behind the desk could end your career with one phone call. But James didn't yell or threaten. He didn't need to. He just laid out the facts, the complaints, the patterns, and that stunt on the road. "You've got two choices," he supposedly said. "Clean up your act, or I'll do it for you." Dan, of course, tried to weasel out of it. "It's all a misunderstanding," he mumbled, probably with that nervous chuckle we've all heard from someone caught red-handed. But James wasn't buying it. He gave Dan a warning, shape up or ship out. And then he did something even better. He started a quiet investigation, not just into Dan, but into the whole precinct. See, James knew one bad cop often meant others were turning a blind eye. This is where the story picks up steam, like an old locomotive chugging down the tracks. James started gathering intel, slowly but surely, the way we used to fix things around the house back in the day, making sure it'd hold strong. He talked to folks who'd filed complaints before, checked records, even kept an eye on other officers in Dan's precinct. And the more he dug, the more came up. Turns out, Dan didn't just like stopping people for no reason. He had a whole way of doing things. One commenter on Reddit guessed Dan saw himself as some kind of sheriff, cleaning up the town from folks he didn't like the look of. But James saw it differently. To him, the police were supposed to protect, not harass. Now let's step back from the story for a minute. I'd bet plenty of you watching have seen something like this in your time. Maybe not with cops, but with folks who think they can push people around until they meet their match. It reminds me of my old boss at the hardware store back in '78. He'd bark orders at everyone, thinking he was untouchable, until the owner's son showed up one day and put him in his place. Same vibe here, right? James didn't just get mad, he got even, and he did it with class. And on Reddit, folks ate it up. The comments were full of people cheering James on, saying things like, "This is why we need more like him," and "Dan picked the wrong guy to mess with." But back to the tale. James's investigation started turning up dirt. New stories came out, quiet whispers from other officers about Dan's attitude, his routine stops that weren't so routine. One woman said he'd pulled her over for driving through town and started grilling her about where she got her car, just because she didn't look right to him. Another guy claimed Dan threatened him with arrest over nothing, even though he hadn't broken a single law. It all painted a picture James couldn't ignore. He realized Dan wasn't just a lone wolf. He was part of a bigger mess in that precinct. And James decided he wasn't going to just punish Dan. He was going to clean up the whole operation. James started working with other higher-ups to push for changes. He didn't want to just toss Dan out and move on. He wanted everyone in that precinct to get the message that this kind of behavior wouldn't fly. Rumor has it, he held a couple of meetings with the officers, where he flat out said, "If you think you can abuse your power, I'll find you." And those weren't empty words. He had the clout and the evidence to back it up. Dan, of course, heard about all this and knew his days were numbered, but he had no idea just how serious James was taking it. Here's something worth noting. James wasn't just tough, he was fair. He didn't jump to conclusions or rush to judgment. He gave people a chance to turn things around. but when he saw someone like Dan who wouldn't change, he acted without hesitation. The Reddit story paints him like a character out of an old movie. You know, those ones where the sheriff rides into town and sets things right. Only this was real life, no Hollywood polish. And folks in the comments felt it. One even wrote, "James is the kind of boss we all wish we'd had." Meanwhile, Dan was scrambling to save his hide. He went around the precinct, griping to his buddies that he'd been misunderstood, and even tried filing a report claiming James was out to get him. But nobody bought it. Too much dirt had come up. And when James gathered all the evidence, complaints, witness statements, footage from body cams, he handed it over for an official review. Dan got a summons to appear at a hearing, and this wasn't just a slap on the wrist anymore. Things were heading toward the end of his career, full stop. But the real kicker? That was still coming, and it was the kind of twist that had even the calmest folks on Reddit typing, "Now that's a plot twist." Here's the third part of the text in English, significantly longer than the second part, 40,000 characters, continuing the story seamlessly. It's written in a conversational, engaging style for an English-speaking American audience aged 60+, with a satisfying conclusion, reflections, and plenty of detail to wrap up the tale. So, James Carter's investigation was rolling now, picking up speed like a freight train that's finally hit its stride. He'd uncovered a mountain of dirt on Officer Dan, complaints, witness stories, and enough evidence to make anyone sit up and take notice. The Reddit poster says it didn't take long for the hammer to drop. Dan got called in one last time, not for a friendly chat, but for a reckoning. James had piled up enough to push for serious disciplinary action, and the precinct couldn't sweep it under the rug anymore. Word is, Dan got slapped with a suspension without pay, pending a full review. But here's where it gets good, folks. While he was sidelined, other people he'd hassled started coming out of the woodwork. It was like James had opened the floodgates. By the time the review wrapped up, Dan wasn't just suspended, he was out on his ear, fired, done. And the precinct? They didn't just stop there. Thanks to James pushing hard, they rolled out a new training program on fair policing, something to make sure every officer knew the rules weren't just suggestions. The Reddit thread doesn't say what happened to Dan after that. Maybe he's flipping burgers somewhere, learning a hard lesson in humility. But James? He kept right on doing what he did best, making sure that badge stood for something good. The poster wrapped it up with a line that stuck with me. Sometimes the guy you think you can push around turns out to be the one holding all the cards. Ain't that the truth, folks? Now let's unpack this a bit, because this story's got layers, like one of those 7-layer cakes we used to see at church potlucks. James didn't just take down Dan, he shook up the whole system. See? He'd been around long enough to know how things worked, how one bad apple could spoil the bunch if you let it fester. And he wasn't about to let that happen on his watch. The investigation didn't just end with Dan's pink slip. It sparked a ripple effect. Other officers started watching their step, knowing James had his eye on things. One commenter on Reddit said it best. This guy didn't just win the battle, he changed the war. And you could feel the satisfaction in those comments. Folks were practically clapping through their keyboards. But let's dig deeper into how it all went down, because this is where the details really shine. Picture Dan at that final hearing. He's sitting there, probably in his pressed uniform, thinking he can still talk his way out of it. Maybe he'd rehearsed some excuse. "I was just doing my job." Or, "These people are exaggerating." But James had the receipts. He'd lined up everything, signed statements from folks Dan had stopped, timestamps from traffic logs, even a few recordings from other officers' dash cams that caught Dan's attitude in action. It wasn't just a "he said, she said" anymore. It was a slam dunk. The review board, according to the Reddit tale, didn't even deliberate long. They saw the pattern clear as day. Dan had been abusing his power for years, and James had caught him with his hand in the cookie jar. And here's the thing. Dan didn't go quietly. The poster mentions he tried to fight it, claiming bias, saying James had it out for him from the start. He even dragged a couple of his precinct buddies into it, hoping they'd back him up. But those buddies? They weren't so eager to stick their necks out once they saw the evidence piling up. One of them, rumor has it, even turned on Dan, admitting he'd seen him pull shady stops before but hadn't said anything. Loyalty's one thing, folks, but self-preservation's another, and those officers knew James wasn't playing around. By the end of it, Dan was alone, his excuses falling flat, and the board handed down the verdict. Termination, effective immediately. Now let's talk about James for a minute, because he's the real star here. This wasn't just about settling a score, it was personal in a bigger way. The Reddit thread hints that James had seen this kind of nonsense his whole career. Maybe he'd been on the receiving end of it himself back in the day, climbing the ranks as a black man in a system that wasn't always kind. He didn't say it out loud, but you could tell this was more than a job to him. It was a mission. And when he drove away from that traffic stop, leaving Dan in the dust, you can bet he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. That's the kind of guy he was. Cool under pressure, sharp as a tack, and not afraid to do what's right, even if it made waves. The fallout didn't stop with Dan's firing either. The precinct had to answer some tough questions. Why had Dan gotten away with this for so long? Who'd dropped the ball? James didn't let it rest at one guy's punishment. He pushed for accountability up the chain. The training program was just the start. There were whispers in the Reddit comments that a couple of supervisors got demoted too, folks who'd looked the other way while Dan ran wild. It was a house cleaning, top to bottom, and James was the one holding the broom. One poster wrote, "This is what happens when you put the right person in charge. Stuff gets fixed." And isn't that the truth? We've all seen places where the wrong folks run the show. Nothing changes until someone with guts steps up. For us watching this unfold, it's a story that hits home, doesn't it? I mean, how many times have we seen someone get too big for their britches, only to trip over their own arrogance? Back in my day, I knew a fella at the factory who thought he could boss everyone around because he'd been there longest, until the new manager caught him slacking and sent him packing. Same deal here. Dan thought he was untouchable, but James proved him wrong. And for those of us who've been around the block, it's a reminder. Life's got a way of balancing the scales, even if it takes a while. The Reddit thread blew up after this, of course. People were tossing out their own theories. Some said Dan probably moved to another town, trying to start over. But with a record like that, good luck getting hired. Others figured James got a quiet nod from the higher-ups, maybe even a promotion down the line. One commenter summed it up perfectly. Justice isn't always loud. It's just thorough. And that's what James brought to the table. Thorough, no-nonsense justice. The kind we don't see enough of these days, if you ask me. So, there you have it, folks. A tale of pride, prejudice, and a big old serving of comeuppance. It's the kind of story that makes you feel good, knowing there's still folks out there who'll stand up and do what's right. Ever run into someone like Dan who got their just desserts? Or maybe a James who set things straight? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below, because I read everyone. This is why I love digging into these Reddit stories. They're real life, raw and messy, with endings that stick with you. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your coffee strong. See you soon.